السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لفك شفرة الإمكانات الحقيقية للخطاب الأخير للرئيس الروسي فلاديمير بوتين في فالداي فيما يتعلق بحل النزاع مع الغرب، علينا أن نعود بحسب المراقبين وللمفارقة إلى القرن الخامس عشر. كان الحدث آنذاك واكتشاف نص أطلق في فلورنسا دي ميديتشي، مما أدخل أوروبا في دوامة من الإثارة. إنها الهرمتيكا، التي كانت مجموعة من النصوص من المعروف وجودها كمصدر غير عادي للمعرفة الداخلية التي أتت قبل المسيحية بوقت طويل. ولكن كانت هناك مشكلة واحدة فقط لم يقرأها أحد في أوروبا. لكن ما علاقة هذا بخطاب بوتين في فالداي؟ حسناً، له علاقة عميقة إن كان عن طريق القياس والتحذير أيضاً. في ذلك الزمن، أي في القرن الخامس عشر، كان أيضاً وقتاً ينذر بالخطر المتربص والمظلم، حيث بدت الحرب المفتوحة بين الطوائف المسيحية وقت ذاك حتمية مع عواقب وخيمة على العالم الغربي. لعل اليوم ما يحدث لنا في النهاية تحدده الأحداث السابقة، أي بهذه الطريقة يتم تعريف كل ما يحدث بشيء من الماضي بأنه حدث معروف بالفعل بالمعنى التجريبي، ولكن بتبني المنظور الهرمسي بالسماح لأنفسنا بالاندفاع إلى الأمام كما لو كان مغناطيسياً في العيش في بعض القيم الأساسية والسرديات، قد نحرر أنفسنا من الثقل التاريخي. كان هذا هو الجانب الإبداعي من الهرمسية التي أثارت حماسة أتباعها. إنها أيضاً طريقة مختلفة لتصور وفهم معنى السيادة. إنها تشمل في داخلها فكرة اكتساب السيادة من خلال التصرف والتفكير بشكل سيادي، وتنبع هذه القوة السيادية من ثقة شعب له تاريخه المميز والواضح وإرثه الفكري ومخزونه الروحي الذي يمكنه الاعتماد عليه والتميز به. ولعل هذه هي الجواهر الخفية في خطاب الرئيس بوتين في فالداي. فهل سيقرأها أحد في أوروبا اليوم؟ يطيب لنا أن نستقبل الأستاذ تيم أندرسون، الباحث والمحاضر الجامعي ومدير مركز دراسات مكافحة الهيمنة ومقره سيدني في أستراليا. أهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. Dr. Tim Anderson, director of the Sydney-based Centre for Counter-Hegemonic Studies and writer, researcher from Sydney, Australia. Welcome to Min al-Dakhil from the Inside, Tim.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being with us, and pure pleasure to have you always. Well, Tim, when you talk about West Asia, you don't talk from a faraway distance or decipher or analyze a spot or a geography or a culture that you have never been to or seen with all your senses, or mingled with its peoples, ate their food and experienced their unique cultural diversity, suffering and agonies. Just in the last couple of months, we've met in various capitals across the region. Tim, to what extent is it indispensable to engage before judging or deciding or writing reports and analysis about what the people of these nations actually want?
Well, as you said, I think we have five senses, and I believe it is important to read history, but it's also important to listen and to see, and as you say, to be with people and see what their priorities are, because all of us necessarily cross a culture where we have certain ideas and we can't get rid of that, but it's important to see what other people's priorities in particular are, what concerns them.
Mm-hmm. Which capital of West Asia captured your attention the most, and why?
Well, I think Damascus, because initially I was concerned that very few people in my culture understood the nature of the war that was being carried out against Syria. And other friends in other parts of the world convinced me that the Syrians were decent people who deserved friendship and a closer observation of what was going on. And from Damascus, I've been lucky enough to have the opportunity to visit a number of the other countries and capitals in the region.
Now, the one redeeming feature of the US-EU siege of West Asia, one of the worst crimes of the 21st century, as many argue, is that it is forcing a restructuring of international economic, financial, monetary relations away from a Washington-centered unipolar world. How plain, apparent, and swift is this birth today, Tim?
It's increasingly apparent, I suppose, with the spread of proxy wars and economic wars in particular, even though large populations are fooled by the appearance of these proxy wars. Ukraine is just the latest of those, isn't it, where a proxy army is being used to attack Russia, for example. So there's a lot of skill in the propaganda that comes with these proxy wars, but nevertheless, analysts on all sides are now saying and understanding that because the big powers have been drawn into it, the big powers of which the US is jealous, China and Russia and Iran in particular, they know that there is a global power struggle going on, and there is a link between all of these different proxy wars and the economic war that's really engulfing the whole planet at the moment.
Right. What is the link, Tim?
The link is that there are alliances and blocs. For example, there is an important Eastern bloc creating new institutions like the Shanghai Cooperation and like BRICS and other groups, other types of financial institutions. And the old Western institutions of the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, the SWIFT system, the dollar and so on are increasingly under challenge. And that, as I said, is apparent to analysts across the board now.
Tim, how do you draw and comment and elaborate on the regional integration into the Eastern blocs?
Well, it's something that's happening slow from the point of view of the countries in the Levant, really, but it's increasingly popular. With the expansion of these wars and economic wars in particular, we've seen a great attractiveness of the Eastern blocs, the Shanghai Cooperation, the BRICS, to a large number of other countries. Really, the majority of the world is gravitating towards the new Eastern alternatives to the Western blocs, and it's very apparent.
Now, allow me now to take you to something very important to shed light on. Well, Malcolm X said about the mainstream media, the MSM, and corporate media that it is an irresponsible media. It will make the criminal look like he's the victim and make the victim look like he's the criminal. If you aren't careful, the media will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. This is the sort of propaganda tactic that I, and these are the words of Malcolm X, would call a psychological warfare. Well, Tim, psychologists have shown that pre-bunking or preemptively warning people about incorrect or misleading information is more effective than debunking falsehoods. Do you agree?
Yes, you're talking about a type of vaccination of people from propaganda, but it's quite difficult because the propaganda these days is a terrible virus. It's really, and very skillful in many respects. We should acknowledge that the arrogant powers, as they're often called, are quite skillful when it comes to media manipulation and disarming whole populations. There are people, even in this part of the world, for example, that don't think that they are under blockade. They don't think that they are affected by these economic wars when they are. So it's very powerful, and it's an extraordinary thing for someone who's involved in writing or educating, as I've been, to see that very highly educated populations are so easily disarmed by these propaganda wars.
How to face such kind of psychological warfare tactics, in your opinion?
There has to be counter-organisation, there has to be counter-hegemony projects, practical projects, and also media, ideological, communicational projects, cultural projects, like the Palestine Literature Prize that was carried out recently here in Lebanon. For example, affirming the culture, affirming the humanity, the depth of humanising the people who are under the thumb, so to speak, in this part of the world.
Right. I will come to ask you a bit more about this particular prize, but allow me to continue on the subject of psychological warfare. Well, most of the techniques of psychological warfare were developed during World War II or even earlier and have been used to some degree in every conflict since. Daniel Lerner was in the OSS, which is the predecessor of the American CIA. He divides psychological warfare operations into three categories: the white propaganda about omissions and emphasis, truthful and not strongly biased, where the source of information is acknowledged, gray propaganda, omissions, emphasis, and racial, ethnic, religious bias, largely truthful, containing no information that can be proven wrong, the source is not identified, and you have black propaganda, commissions of falsification, inherently deceitful information given in the product is attributed to a source that was not responsible for its creation. Well, Tim Lerner says gray and black operations ultimately have a heavy cost in that the target population sooner or later recognizes them as propaganda and discredits the source. We have to scrutinize every piece of information before adopting and liking it. In the recent events in Iran, Tim, what sort of propaganda has the West, spearheaded by the US, use and employ?
Well, that sort of propaganda, which in many respects mirrors the propaganda used in Syria only a bit more than a decade ago, is something that really has a short-term requirement. In other words, they don't need for people to believe that propaganda in a year or two's time. It's simply to cover the fact that, for example, you have some peaceful protests there and you have violent terrorist groups taking advantage of that and carrying out terrorist acts and sabotage under the cover of those peaceful protests. So in that sense, for example, if we recall the situation in Libya, all of the lies told about Libya were exposed, but that was after the state had been destroyed and NATO had bombed Libya. So in many respects, I don't think they're going to achieve that in Iran. Iran is a much stronger and bit larger state than Libya, but it's the short-term effect of disempowering people, thinking that it's something, thinking that an act of terrible violence and even when it comes to the economic wars, genocidal violence, is actually in the name of human rights or the rights of women. It's a very cynical but often quite effective in the short-term technique.
Now, allow me to ask you here something about the dismantling of the old Israel, which will be so dramatic that few will pay attention to key details of the what you termed in your article the new Israel. But those details will be very important for the long-suffering Palestinian population. Why do you reckon, Tim, that the dismantling of apartheid Israel may come sooner than expected, however, in a more complicated manner?
I say that because while it is the resistance of the Palestinian people and their regional supporters that is driving this movement, there is also a deep divide opening up between what I call the liberal Zionists and the openly fascist Zionists, in the sense that the liberals have carried this long-term myth of an Arab state, of a two-state solution, and saying even that they support the Palestinian people, while the fascist side says they don't care. But the liberal side of Zionists, which dominate in the USA, for example, are important. They are now campaigning against apartheid in Israel, some of them. They're very concerned about this. They dislike extremely the Netanyahus of the world, for example, and so I believe they're going to play a role in dismantling a state that's been branded more and more in recent years an apartheid state, which is a crime against humanity under international law, and the international community has a responsibility to dismantle the apartheid state. However, as the most recent Special Rapporteur on the human rights in the occupied territories said, apartheid is not the only problem of the Palestinian people. even dismantling apartheid, let's say citizenship rights are granted to Palestinian people, you still have a number of potential compromises which are very important. For example, to do with special privileges that might be allocated to recent settlers, to do with the ownership of land and prohibitions on the redistribution of land, to do with the right to return for the refugees, for example. So those sorts of details will become important. I believe that one part of the Zionists are going to play a role in dismantling the apartheid regime. But what sort of system will we have after that? It deserves some attention, I believe.
Right. I would appreciate, Tim, if you can tell us about what new challenges do the Palestinian resistance and its allies face today in your perspective?
Well, I think one, they're overcoming the new initiatives in coming together in the resistance within Palestine is very important, because the fragmentation was something that left them very vulnerable to exploitation. There is still this role of talking about what we want after the dismantling of apartheid, and that's important, that Palestinian voices, the resistance voices I should say, not collaborative voices, but Palestinian resistant voices need to be heard in terms of the detail of what comes after the dismantling of the apartheid system, because it must be dismantled, and there are even Zionist voices saying it must be dismantled now.
How do you hear and listen and comprehend and digest those Zionist voices who are talking about the dismantling of Israel?
They are not talking exactly about dismantling, but they are talking about apartheid. They cannot tolerate the fact that their self-image, our liberal Zionists as tolerant people who are inclusive and don't want to harm the Arab people and so on, they can't tolerate being branded with a stamp which says this is a crime against
humanity. Like those who
humanity.
talked about the abolition of slavery in the US of A, and then came Jim Crow laws.
Exactly. So after the abolition of slavery, we have that new form of racial system.
Yes.
After the elimination of the racial regime in Zimbabwe, we have a whole series of compromises which prohibited the redistribution of land, special privileges for the white colonialists, you know. So there are recent precedents too, that there are some important compromises that are made in the process of dismantling an old racial state.
Right. Now, the Palestine International Award, the prize for literature, which you have mentioned earlier, held under the auspices of the Lebanese Ministry of Culture in association with its Iranian counterpart and organized by Risalat Arts Association. How essential and effective is it to keep on storytelling, documenting, and reviving the narrative of struggle and the daily accounts of the Palestinian resistance and their victories, their suffering, of course, for the generations to come?
Well, I think you summed it up quite well. It's very important to humanize that experience, to humanize the people through literature, because we are a very literate population in the world today. But on the other side, you have the constant humanizing of the Zionists and an attempt to portray them as the only democracy in the region. And this is against the resistance. We have these forces of Hollywood. They have Hollywood on their side. They have this constant repetition on their side. So there is a disposition of people all around the world to listen to the Palestinian people, but where are they getting that information? Where are they getting the depth of the humanity and the cultural expression of those people? And so I think that Literature Prize was a very important contribution to humanising the experience of the Palestinian people.
Right. Now, allow me to take you to your country and to the nearby region. Rapprochement, or the rebuilding of cordial relations after a period of disconnect, allows for productive dialogue and will stop the relationship backsliding further. As far as Australia and China are concerned, and with the Labour government of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, do we sense a sort of re-engagement, a road perhaps towards rapprochement, to promote the development of a comprehensive strategic partnership between the two countries?
Between China, you mean?
Right, between China and Australia, of course.
Well, of course, China has been Australia's largest trade partner for some time, and even when I was at school more than 50 years ago, they were telling us our future is with Asia, and so there have been these developments over many decades, which are all of a sudden confronted by the fact that the extreme jealousy of the USA, which is the type of big brother to my country, requires us now to go into a confrontation with China, which is an economic and military giant and poses no direct threat to our country at all. It's an extraordinary confrontation, extraordinary contradiction, but politicians in our country have not showed independent political will to break from that relationship with the US. Only in some small respects. For example, I notice that the British as well as the Australians are going back from the Trump position of trying to recognise Al-Quds as the capital of the Israelis. But that's a minor adjustment. I think generally speaking there is still a long way to go there, and the positive developments in my country are really coming from cultural events and trade unions, where there is indeed some movement to cut off those ties with apartheid Israel, to boycott, for example, Israeli funding of our major cultural event, the Sydney Festival. My own union, the Universities Union of Australia, now has a policy to support boycott on Israel. So there is some movement at a popular level, but usually the governments in our system come last when it comes to making a change.
But I'm asking about China today. How do you define the relationship between Australia and China?
It's extremely...
Not only in terms of trade.
It's extremely stressed. There is a diplomatic Cold War going on. There are Australian warships off the coast of China arguing that they have a right to be there. The Chinese are saying, why are you there? It has damaged our trade substantially already. It's damaged trade and investment. So it's really ruptured. This pressure from the US has ruptured that good relationship. And of course that has important economic impacts on the Australian economy as well.
Right. Now, I cannot but ask you, Tim, about the physical sanctions or the unilateral coercive measures. What are they? What are the UCMs? And when can they be justified in your opinion?
Well, the unilateral coercive measures, as you mentioned, that's a name that's given to things that are wrongly called sanctions imposed unilaterally, mainly by the European Union and the USA, almost entirely by the European Union and the USA. And they are attempts to coerce governments that they do not like. For example, whether it's a government in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Iran, in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua. These sorts of things are not really sanctions. They do not comply with international law. There are some that do comply with international law. For example, the Security Council sanctions against Yemen, which I think are also unjustified. But for the most part, it's really unilateral measures which the...
In this sense, Tim, since you mentioned Yemen, why do you strongly believe that the UN Security Council has betrayed the people of Yemen time and again?
Because unanimously the Security Council has failed to recognise the Ansarallah-led government in Sana'a controlling 3/4 of the people of Yemen, and they've maintained through old resolutions that a person in exile, Mansour Hadi in Riyadh, is still the president after 7 years of not being in the country. It's an extraordinary lapse by the UN Security Council, and it was unanimous. There is no country yet that has challenged that in the UN Security Council. I think Russia abstained once.
Right, Dr. Tim Anderson, thank you very much for sharing your authentic views and for always being here on the ground and in the region with us and for us, coming all the way from Australia. Always a pleasure to have you, Tim.
Thank you. You're welcome.
ودائما الشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة، وللتفاعل أكثر تابعونا على صفحات السوشيال ميديا. وحتى نلتقي من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.